Hello, everyone. I'm Krishna Gade, founder CEO of Fiddler AI. So nice to see all of you. Thank you for joining us at the XAI Summit 2021. Just want to give some context about the summit. As you may have all observed, we are truly living in the age of AI. Right? We are seeing its adoption increase across the sectors rapidly. Today, AI impacts our day-to-day lives from news consumptions to how we purchase a house, or how we get into a new job, what mortgage rate we get approved, many aspects of our lives. However, there are many risks that AI carries today in terms of how it gets operationalized. I would like to categorize them into four main areas. Number one, ethical risk. We are seeing, AI can make bad decisions for users and potentially unethical decisions. It's very important to know whether that is actually happening or not when you're actually operationalizing it. Operational risk. A lot of teams don't have visibility into how AI affects their business metrics. Reputation risk. These days we are seeing AI affecting the company's brands in a negative manner, and it's very important for organizations to know whether that is actually happening or not. Compliance risk. Is my AI compliant with new and upcoming regulations? It's very important for organizations to look at it. In the past few years, we have seen numerous incidents along these lines, whether that is from Facebook to Apple, to from Goldman Sachs to United Healthcare, where these issues have come to light. It's becoming obvious that humans don't want a future ruled by unregulated, capricious, and potentially biased AI systems. Since AI is permeating all aspects of our lives today, do we continue to let it operate the way it is, in the black box, without any human oversight? We believe it would result in a dystopian view of the world, where unfair decisions will get made by unseen AI systems operating in the unknown. This is why we created Fiddler 3 years ago. We started the XAI Summit with 20 people in late 2018 in a tiny conference room. As the community grew, we're proud to say today about 1,000 people signed up for this conference, where we brought eminent speakers and panels to talk about the advances being made in this space. And we'd like to share all this information with you all. And we want to make this movement grow and make it much larger. Now I've let Amit, my co-founder, to talk about the summit and also introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Krishna. Hi, everyone. My name's Amit. I'm one of the founders and the Chief Product Officer. Welcome again to this exciting MLOps edition of our Explainable AI Summit. Now, machine learning ops, or MLOps, is top of mind for everyone here as teams are accelerating the deployment of their models at scale. And we all know how machine learning models are different from traditional software, right? These are differences that require a new development lifecycle, and one that accounts for models which can be data-centric, that are iteratively developed, and that are increasingly opaque. So to succeed in machine learning today, companies need to embrace this new workflow that comes with its new processes, that comes with its new tools. And we've seen a lot of new stories on concerns around responsible AI, as well as potential upcoming regulations, which make it even more vital that companies implement machine learning correctly. So today, you'll hear from a group of industry experts on machine learning topics across ethics, explainability, monitoring, banking, conversational AI, as well as data-centric development. We hope you enjoy each one of these sessions as much as we've enjoyed curating it and bringing it to you. So let's get started. Please welcome next Yoav Schlesinger. Yoav is the director of the ethical AI practice at Salesforce, and he will be presenting our opening keynote, Where to Next? An AI Ethics Maturity Model. Cool, welcome Yoav.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here. Let me share what I think should hopefully be the right tab. There we go. Good morning, everyone. Really pleased to be here. I am Yoav Schlesinger, Director of Ethical AI Practice at Salesforce. I use he, him pronouns. I am a white male with short brown hair wearing a purplish shirt this morning and coming to you from my home in Marin County, California, right north of San Francisco. Today, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about an AI ethics maturity model and thinking about how we who sit in organizations of all sizes can drive toward a more responsible, explainable, and ethical future. But before I get there, just a quick forward-looking statement. This is a lot of legalese, which I don't expect you to read, but take this for what it's worth. Nothing that I say this morning should be used to make purchasing decisions about Salesforce. I may say things that might have implications for Salesforce and our business, etc. And you should use caution in making any purchasing decisions as a customer, as a consumer, etc. So let's get started. I want to take you to a particular moment. Welcome to Detroit and Chicago of the early 20th century. You can see rush hour and what it was like to be on the streets at a moment in time where new technologies had been introduced to the roads. For the first time, pedestrians, horses, horse-drawn carriages, trolley cars, and automobiles were all intersecting in ways that had previously been unforeseen and undiscovered. And the challenge was to figure out how to put all of these things on the road together safely. In fact, the first automobiles were introduced onto the roads in around 1896 or so, but the first stop sign wasn't introduced until 1915 in Detroit. And the first traffic lights weren't introduced until 1926. So in the early years of motoring, about 3/4 of auto accident victims were pedestrians because pedestrians didn't know which way to look. Look for horses, look for streetcars, look for automobiles, etc. And in fact, this was such a problem that during the first few years of World War I, more Americans were actually killed in auto accidents than American soldiers were killed in France. This was a tremendous problem. And on the far right here, you can actually see this extended even into the 1950s and 1960s in terms of automobile safety with the Chevy Corvair, which was known to be a particularly problematic car and introduced because of the growing awareness of the safety standards that would be required to protect pedestrians and motorists on the streets, introduced a whole new array of safety features and regulation as a result of all of these intersecting new technologies. But automobiles are not the only industry that's had this experience as well. So amazingly, there was a point in time where DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, was widely used as a synthetic insecticide in the 1940s. And it was used to combat malaria, typhus, and other insect-borne diseases. And it was widely used to control even mosquitoes and home pests. Its quick success as a pesticide and broad use led to the development of resistance by many insect pests, leading people to increase the use of DDT. And it was only later on that all of the negative impacts of DDT were really seen on crops, on livestock, and of course on people as well. Food safety. These are images of the slaughterhouses of Chicago and elsewhere in the late 19th century and early 20th century. There were foodborne illnesses that extended from the practices engaged in these food production facilities. And it wasn't until there was scrutiny placed on it that there was a broad recognition of the harms of this particular kind of industrial manufacturing of food for the first time after sort of the first wave of industrialization in the United States. And of course, aviation as well. almost as many pilots died in training to fly the World War I Camel fighter as died in actual combat flying, because the plane was so tricky and difficult. It was unstable and challenging to fly, had sensitive controls, and made it maneuverable for an experienced pilot, but really contributed to a whole range of inexperienced pilot accidents. And in fact, later on, in 1956, it was the Grand Canyon mid-air collision when 128 people died due to a mid-air collision between a United Airlines airliner and a TWA airliner that actually took the space and moved it forward into air traffic control further down the road and led to major aviation reforms. And finally, pharmaceuticals. Thalidomide was widely prescribed as a curative for morning sickness in pregnant women in the 1940s and 1950s. And it wasn't until the early 1960s that there was a growing awareness of the incredibly damaging impacts to newborns of thalidomide that led to the instantiation of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, in the early 1960s. All of these industries, in other words, had a moment. They had a moment at which there was a broad, growing, or deeply entrenched recognition of the harms potentially brought by these technologies and the need to do something about it. And it was, in large measure, books, which were the technology of the 20th century, that raised awareness to these harms, right? So you have The Jungle in 1906 by Upton Sinclair, An Agricultural Testament by Sir Albert Howard in 1940, which raised awareness of organic farming practices for the first time. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1972, which also led to the awareness around DDT and its harms, leading to reforms there. And of course, Unsafe at Any Speed, Ralph Nader's book from 1965, which ultimately led to the creation of the National Transportation Safety Board and other reforms as well. Each of these books arrived in a moment at which society was having a reckoning around the potential harms of these technologies. And so either these books introduced the awareness or arrived at a moment of awareness to create some sort of fundamental change. And so the question we have before us this morning is this AI's moment? The headlines over the last few years might indicate that we are, in fact, at such a moment. I'll share a few with you that give a nod to the accelerating role of AI in societal harm in most cases. So, of course, we're all familiar with these, but here, Amazon's recruiting tool that was biased against women, notably because of its training data sets and the kinds of people that Amazon had hired previously. Google Photos debacle, if you will, around tagging certain images of Black Americans as gorillas. You have the, story of Microsoft Hey and teaching a chatbot to be racist in 24 hours. You have facial recognition technologies leading to the false arrests of many people around the country due to its bias against people with darker skin tones. You have incidents like Waze in Google Maps sending California residents actually straight into wildfires. And because we have been acculturated and learned to rely on these systems without even questioning them, motorists driving straight into fire. And most recently, the algorithms underlying Facebook's newsfeed and perpetuating misinformation and accelerating the spread of mis and disinformation over the last few years and its impacts on democracy. Those headlines have also been undergirded by the books of this moment that have called our attention to the harms of AI. These books, all, by the way, written by women and many by underrepresented minority women, notable in that respect, have all taken the form, I would suggest, of Unsafe at Any Speed, Silent Spring, etc., and calling our attention to this moment. The question will be how we as a society and how we as leaders in our organizations and developers of AI systems respond. The challenge is that we will have to lead. In the past, when these books and when this societal reckoning has happened, we have had more political alignment, if you will, than we find ourselves with at this current moment. Here you have a visualization of congressional polarization over time in terms of the likelihood of House representatives, Democrats and Republicans, to vote with their own party or across party lines. You can see in the 1940s, there was a tremendous amount of that. Today, not as much. And so while we had the regulatory introductions of the FDA, NTSB, NHTSA, the FAA, et cetera, to regulate these other industries, it is my hypothesis that the regulation will not be forthcoming on AI with quite as much speed as we have seen the response to these other industries in the past. Now, that matters because AI is accelerating in a way that none of these other industries or technologies have accelerated in the past, right? If you look, 1.4 estimated billion automobile drivers will be on the roads globally by 2025. That will have taken 139 years to reach that point. If you use 1896 or so, it's the introduction of automobiles to the roads. 3 times that number of people will be on social media at the same moment. And the time to have reached that will be roughly 21 years since 2004 and the introduction of Facebook onto the social media landscape. That means that we don't have time to wait. We don't have the ability to sit around and wait for regulation to be forthcoming. When you see the acceleration of the number of parameters in NLP models, and even in just the last 2 years, or the volume of data and information being created, captured, and copied, the acceleration is far greater than any of these other technologies. So we, as technology creators, have a fundamental responsibility to society to ensure that their adoption of these technologies is safe. Excuse me. You are probably all familiar with this technology adoption curve. It takes us over time being on the x-axis here, of the adoption of new technologies from early adopters and innovators to the skeptics and laggards who adopt technology much later on. I would like to suggest this morning that the tipping point of Silent Spring, Unsafe at Any Speed, algorithms of oppression occurs somewhere at the moment in the adoption of the visionaries and pragmatists, somewhere in that range, when the majority of people have adopted a technology. And there is that recognition, that pragmatic recognition of the potential harms of the technology as it sees widespread adoption. Now, in order to make sure that there is a safe adoption of those technologies, Patrick Hudson has offered up a safety culture evolutionary model, which suggests how industries evolve in terms of their regard for safety, both of consumers and others. And this model sort of maps to those other industries that I was talking about earlier, right? You first have a pathological stage where management believes that accidents are caused by stupidity, inattention, or even willfulness. So who cares as long as we're not caught? That moves to a reactive stage where safety becomes a priority mostly after an accident. And that's important there because, again, there is this moment, that tipping point where the accident may cause and create a moment of new safety regimes. That moves then to a calculative stage where organizations put safety processes and systems into operation. That then transitions to becoming a proactive organization that makes processes and systems that are now in operation effective, and ends with a generative safety culture where all of these elements come to fruition. And all along the way there's increasing informedness and increasing trust in the organization and in the technology. So that technology and that culture is undergirded by leadership, where leaders are not afraid to do difficult things, by respect, where individuals are respected and experts are listened to, mindfulness, where everyone is wary and always ready for the unexpected, justice and fairness, with clear lines between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable that everyone agrees upon, and learning, where the culture is willing to adapt and implement necessary reforms based on the lessons learned. So safety, let's use as a proxy for ethics. I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably to examine where we are on Hudson's safety ladder and on the technology adoption curve, right? If you merge those two models, you see something of a mapping between the pathological stage and then the reactive and calculative stage of the progress on Hudson's safety ladder, where when you have that tipping point between visionaries and pragmatists, you see the real move between reactive and calculative safety cultures. Now, naturally, you're going to be asking the question of, doesn't this just cost money? Doesn't ethical AI, doesn't responsible AI, explainable AI, safety just cost money? And the answer is no. We did a study of 2,400 consumers worldwide, 86% of which said they would be more loyal to ethical companies, 69% of whom said they would spend more with companies they regarded to be ethical, and 75%, 3/4 of those consumers, would not buy from an unethical company. In other words, instantiating safe, ethical AI practices, moving ourselves along Hudson's safety ladder, or what I'll suggest is our own AI ethics maturity model, will move us further along towards encouraging those consumers to adopt AI in safe and responsible ways. That's important because consumers, by and large, don't trust AI. Only 28% of those consumers say they trust AI systems in general, while 90% say that companies have a responsibility to improve the state of the world. In other words, if your company, and I have a guess that most of us here this morning are creating or implementing AI in one way or another, if you are creating or implementing AI and want to earn your customers' trust while avoiding brand, legal, and real harm, you need to implement an ethical AI practice in order to develop and operationalize principles like explainability. So let's get into the AI ethics maturity model itself. Full credit for this goes to Kathy Baxter, my amazing colleague at Salesforce, who has been working for years to develop this maturity model within Salesforce, and only recently has codified it into this formalized form, which I'd like to share with you now. So there are essentially 4 stages of this maturity model. The first is ad hoc, the headline of which is someone raises their hand and starts asking Not just can we do this, but also should we do this, where informal advocacy builds a groundswell of awareness. The second stage is organized and repeatable, where ethical principles and guidelines are agreed upon and ethical reflection and review is added on to existing process. The third stage is managed and sustainable, where ethical considerations are baked in from the beginning of the product development lifecycle. And we end with optimized and innovative, where there are end-to-end inclusive design practices that combine ethical AI product and engineering development with ethical features and the resolution of ethical debt. So I'll get into each of these stages just a little bit more to unpack what each of these implies for the development of these practices within your organizations. So ad hoc. Many of the ethical AI teams, like mine, created in the last 3 to 5 years were the result of employee advocacy or interrogation of the AI models or applications that their companies or teams were building. So some have asked about potential bias in data sets being used to do model training, while others had that recognition of systems like Microsoft Tay or facial recognition systems. Today, more executives and companies are recognizing that unethical AI can result in legal, brand, and financial risk. So as a result, ethical AI teams are an emerging resource in many organizations. In this ad hoc stage of the maturity model, individuals begin identifying unintended consequences and informally advocating for the need to consider bias, fairness, accountability, transparency in their company's AI. And I say informally advocating, which is an important point because those processes have not yet been operationalized or scaled in ways that leads to lasting change at this point in an organization's maturity. Because entire teams and dedicated budgets don't emerge overnight, ethics reviews are done oftentimes in this stage by lone ethics experts, and they're ad hoc and limited to people who have bought into the importance of responsible AI practice in the first place. So here we are asking with little inklings, not just of can we do this, but also should we? We then move to the second stage of the maturity model, the organized and repeatable stage, where an actual team is formed. This may be through current employees changing their roles to focus on AI ethics or through hiring external experts. But ideally, this team encompasses diverse skill sets, backgrounds, and intersections of experience and identity, like race, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, life experience, socioeconomic status, and much more. That mix of human rights, ethics, user research, AI, policy and regulation, data science, product and program management, etc., yields better outcomes. We simply know that to be the fact, and diversity is absolutely your superpower. To require different mechanisms for fair decision making. At this stage, often executive buy-in has been established, and the company is beginning to develop a culture where responsible AI practices are not only recognized, but also rewarded. Part of this culture, that safety culture of leadership and justice that I was talking about earlier, is the articulation or development of a set of ethical principles and guidelines that undergird the work of the development and deployment of responsible AI technologies in the first place. The process of articulating those principles or values can have incredible benefits for creating alignment amongst key internal stakeholders and leaders by virtue of articulating the principles, but then also soliciting commitment to the principles and articulating them publicly. We've obviously seen lots of organizations doing this work, and it is a necessary but not sufficient piece of the puzzle along this AI ethics maturity model. So here are our trusted AI principles. I'm sure you all have your own. These are how we've articulated ours. Responsibility, accountability, transparency, empowerment, and inclusion. Our commitments are to safeguarding human rights, to adherence to regulation, and seeking and leveraging continuous feedback, developing explainable and transparent user experiences to communicate how AI is developed and its limitations. So not just the what and how of our AI systems, but also the why. Empowerment to ensure that we are giving our customers tools to use our AI responsibly. And finally, inclusion, ensuring that all of those impacted by our technologies, not just we are its creators, but all those impacted are respected and included in the process of building our technology in the first place. These principles in this stage of the AI maturity model are beginning to have instantiation as organized process. So these are the practices that we take on to undergird each of those values. So in terms of responsibility, if we have a commitment to upholding human rights, that means we have a commitment to working with human rights experts to inform our technology development. If we believe we should be accountable and seeking and leveraging feedback on our systems, then we commit to engaging an ethical use advisory council comprised of experts and employees to ensure that we're introducing technologies that respect those boundaries. If we commit to transparency, then we will develop model cards and other resources that explain how our systems work. If we believe in empowerment, we build AI apps that are powered through clicks, not code. And lastly, if we commit to inclusion, then we ensure that we are testing and building our AI systems with diverse data sets and inclusive practices that ensure that we are building ethical systems. So in this moment, questions of scale emerge because these processes need to go beyond the central or small team to all employees, right? Like security, ethics is everyone's responsibility. You know, I'm sure you all have requirements for your organizations of strong passwords or other security practices for which you are responsible. Similarly, ethics is everyone's responsibility, and concepts of bias, fairness, human rights, etc., need to be contextualized for every role, but embedded in the education that people receive as they become inculcated with this organizational culture. And that scale can then be achieved by adding ethics reviews to existing AI product reviews. It's not necessarily the most efficient to tack on a review at the end of the development life cycle, but rather to create it as part of that cycle so that ethical debt isn't really accrued, right? Ethical debt being what happens when you launch features that violate those ethical AI principles that you've articulated. Because, for example, you didn't do a bias assessment or you didn't mitigate the bias that you found. When AI ethical debt is accumulated, it's actually more costly to resolve than standard technical debt because you may have to identify new training data or retrain the model or even remove features that you later identified can cause harm. And so as a result, ethics reviews should happen early in the development cycle. It needs to be embedded in this development cycle so that through scoping, review, testing, mitigating, and launching and monitoring an AI model, all along the way, ethical reflection is embedded as part of a mature ethical practice, asking questions of, should this exist? Who will be impacted? Doing bias assessment, then doing bias mitigation, and lastly, doing post-launch assessment that encourages feedback and enables a virtuous cycle of incorporating that assessment and feedback into future iterations of the models. So that is the second stage of the maturity model, organized and repeatable. And I'll quickly touch on the last two stages here as well. So we have the third stage, which is managed and sustainable. So depending on your success at educating existing employees, you may at this point be able to shift your focus to educating new employees about their role in ensuring responsible AI. Every employee working on AI should at least be aware of your ethical AI principles and any customer restrictions on how your AI can be used. So for example, at Salesforce, we don't allow our vision AI to be used for facial recognition. That's a prohibition that everyone in the organization should know. Bias assessment and explainability tooling should be used to consistently identify potential bias and mitigate it, as well as to increase the interpretability of models. So the output from those tools and practices should inform model cards or fact sheets. It's important to never claim 100% bias-free or that a model is completely fair, right? Everyone here knows that any model that appears to be 100% bias-free is probably suffering from overfitting and in all likelihood, poor performance. Then you also need to have post-market monitoring and auditing to understand the real-world impacts of AI on customers and society, because bias and fairness metrics are, in the lab, are only an approximation of what actually happens in the wild. And then lastly, the ethical AI practice needs to be expanded to be inclusive of multiple languages, cultural values, and the context of use. You can't simply overlay what you're doing in the US, for example, onto customers in Japan or Mexico, and expect that you will identify all of the ethical risks or know how to mitigate them. So in this managed and sustainable point, your company should have introduced ethics checkpoints throughout the product lifecycle with formal processes like consequence scanning workshops or harms modeling and community juries, which have been introduced by Microsoft. And documentation of model development and bias should be incorporated into model cards or fact sheets introduced by Google and IBM, which are nutrition labels for models and provide transparency and accountability. These are critical elements of that phase. And then finally, we arrive at an optimized and innovative stage. This is the end state you're striving for. But in the fast-moving and rapidly accelerating field of AI, continuous learning and constant vigilance for new types of harms and ways to mitigate them is required. Right, so a mature AI ethics by design practice combines responsible product development and engineering with holistic privacy, legal, user research, design, and accessibility practices to create an approach that moves from a ad hoc model to product roadmaps and resources that explicitly require the resolution of ethical debt, that set minimum thresholds for launch, and that ensure that those metrics are met, discussed, and deeply understood by those who are making the decisions about safe launch before doing so. So that's a lot. I've run through that very quickly. I want to take a moment to go back to the technology adoption curve, Hudson safety ladder, and now this AI ethics maturity model. So here is the merging of the three models. We move from an ad hoc or reactive stage of safety, of ethics, to a calculative or organized approach once there's mainstream adoption of the technology, to a proactive, managed, and sustainable approach to doing ethics and doing safe product development, finally to an optimized and innovative, generative, optimized stage of technology and safe deployment that ensures that harms are addressed, mitigated, or resolved. By doing that, we build safer AI systems like we have in the past, built safer aviation systems, safer pharmaceutical and food safety practices, and safer automobile practices as well. You know, to go back to automobiles as our example for a moment, in the US auto industry, you saw, beginning with unsafe at any speed in 1965, the introduction of a whole range of regulatory bodies and safety measures to ensure that damage and harm was minimized, right? So very rapidly in 1967, the introduction of the NTSB, followed by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in 1970. In 1979, we required that crash testing be conducted on any new vehicle before it was put to market. In 1983, the launch of Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk campaign by the Ad Council. In 1984, New York State put in place the first requirement for seatbelt wearing in automobiles. In 1988, 1989, airbags became standard, and from 2010 on, things like pedestrian recognition through AI systems have been standardly introduced as well. In other words, we have moved from tipping points to what is hopefully an optimized and innovative safety culture in cars that will continue, obviously, its evolution, but that has over time reached the point where we can be relatively assured of the safety of the vehicles on the road. Obviously not with perfection, but to some degree. Again, this was an evolution that took decades, and we don't have the luxury of waiting any longer. Safety or ethics is a business imperative. It's a must. If you're not offering seatbelts for your AI, you're behind the technology adoption curve. You're behind the AI ethics maturity model curve. You are behind in terms of ensuring that customers and consumers will show loyalty and trust your AI systems. If you're offering seatbelts for your AI, but charging for them, you're behind the curve. If you're offering seatbelts for your AI and airbags and other safety systems that are standard as part of what you're doing, you're on the right path. You know, if this was the evolution of cars over the last century plus, how will you push forward the evolution of explainable and safe AI? Together, we are learning and understanding the risks and harms associated with the AI technologies and applications that we're building. The maturity model that I've suggested this morning will change as a result of, as our understanding and practice develops, but it is clear that we are at the moment, we are at the tipping point where safe and understandable, explainable AI practices are no longer optional. So you and your practices in your organizations need to be on the right side of history. Locate yourself on the maturity model and push your practices forward so that we can ensure the future for everyone on the AI road is safe and secure. Thank you so much. I really appreciated being here. And we do have time for some questions. So I'd love to open it up to Q&A at this point.
Yeah. So Yoav, first, thank you for an amazing keynote. I learned a lot. We had a lot of interaction in the chat. So I pulled out some questions and I can read some of those through for you. And I also want to thank the audience for all the book recommendations and research that's coming through the chat, as well as Yoav. I love reading reading recommendations. So I'm gonna, I'm happily looking for a lot of those books that I hadn't read yet. So the first question that I have is kind of interesting. It's basically the safety, using safety as a representation for ethics. Is quite insightful. And the question is just basically, when did you come to that idea? When did that strike you, and what was the example?
Yeah, I've been noodling on that comparison for a few years, actually. I think starting in about 2017 or so, when I thought that we might be at that kind of tipping point moment and was looking for analogs in history for something that felt similar. And I don't know how or why unsafe at any speed occurred to me. I had read it, I think, at some point in high school or early in college, and it seemed like, oh, wait a second, that is the moment. And so recently I've been looking at these other industries as well. And I'm by no means an expert in any of them. I should not claim to be. I'm only a dilettante who's read a lot about each of them. But I have appreciated sort of the historical reflection, and safety has undergirded each of them, right? Safety has been what's driven the evolution of better practice. And it's, it's clear that AI is not safe for a lot of people in the world. And so that safety is, for me, the analog for ethics, primarily because I'm not a philosopher. For me, ethics is the process of identifying risk and mitigating it. And so if that's the activity of ethics, identifying risk, that's the same thing that safety does, identify risk and mitigate it. So the two seemed natural parallels for me.
Yeah, it was great insight there. So another question that's coming in, this is somewhat related, especially when we think about safety. Very interesting parallels to history of technology development. Even with the NASA systems, when there were engineering failures that started to result in the loss of lives, as well as taxpayer money, there was a pivot to human-centered engineering design. And the question is, does it feel like whether we're in a similar situation or trajectory for AI to have a human-centered AI development? Like we're kind of on this similar parallel. And you may have actually answered that with some of your slides, but I guess to reiterate that question.
I think it's a great question. And it's absolutely true. Actually, human factors design and engineering emerged from cockpit design in World War II fighter jets. When there was... they were all designed standard for a standard height of a pilot, but there was no such thing as an average person, right? Every person had a different height, different weight, et cetera. And so there was a recognition that cockpits needed to be designed, movable seats, so that people could reach the controls in appropriate ways. I tend to alienate some of my friends in the design community when I suggest that I'm not a particular fan of the term human-centered design, actually. But I prefer society-centered design. And the reason is that I believe that the focus on the individual human is the wrong locus for our consideration, right? If I always use this example. If I were developing the optimized breakfast cereal delivery system for my 6-year-old, it would certainly optimize for her as a human and her stated desire to just get Fruit Loops delivered as quickly and as efficiently as possible on repeat, right? But if everybody were just delivering Fruit Loops to their 6-year-olds as a society, we would probably incur all sorts of costs in terms of health, right? In terms of well-being, happiness, et cetera. And so we each make decisions actually, not just for the health and well-being of our children, but as people who would be creating those breakfast delivery systems, we should also be thinking about what the impacts of delivering Fruit Loops might be, right, on a constant basis. And so pivoting to society-centered design means that we're considering all the kids and the impacts of our systems on them, rather than just one kid. And I think that's actually the next horizon for us, is taking that societal impact view rather than just the human impact view, if that makes any sense.
Awesome. Yeah, that does. Great. And I love the metaphor. So it's so visual, but so we have another question here from Rachel. And this is about building code with clicks, building code with clicks, not code. And whether are you suggesting that point and click AI software is more ethical in some way than coding?
Oh, no, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that not everyone has the technical expertise to build apps or technology with code. And so if we believe that people should be empowered to use AI because it delivers all sorts of benefits, by the way, I don't think I said that, but I am not a Luddite. I believe in the promise of AI and its potential to completely transform society for the good. If we think that people should be empowered to have access to that, then we also need to provide ways for them to do that that may be less technical, so that not everyone needs to know Python in order to access AI's promise. That's all I was suggesting. Not that it's more ethical to lower the bar, but that it's more empowering to lower the bar.
Okay, great. Thank you. Quick question, I think, here on whether you have what kind of good metrics you believe there are that define a good explainable model.
Oh, the $1 million question. Obviously, to determine those metrics of quality and accuracy, it really depends on the type of model and the context of use. So there's no singular answer for what is the metric for a safe or explainable model. That process of disambiguation and discernment is critical, though, right? So having that conversation, engaging with the best state-of-the-art research and the data science to understand where to set those thresholds and what those metrics should be is essential. It cannot be taken for granted that the standard metrics should be what we use going forward, in the sense that they may have gotten us to bad points in the past, and you get what you measure. So make sure you're measuring for the right things. So if you're measuring click-through rates and that's your sole metric for success as a business, make sure that that's really what you want to be optimizing for. That's the metric you want to be tracking. And I realize that's not about explainability of a model per se, but it's just simply to say, be careful what you measure.
Great point. An interesting question here on how the mention of the Hudson Safety Ladder regarding safety culture, and thinking about where social media and companies that own those platforms, where would you say they currently stand on that path, on that ladder progression?
I'm not going to get myself in trouble here. I think it depends on the company, and certainly that culture of safety as well being fundamental, right? I would suggest that undergirding that progression along the ladder is the culture, and those 5 elements of culture fundamental to where you will locate yourself as a company or organization on that ladder. So leadership, mindfulness, justice, fairness, right? Those need to be taken seriously. And the more robust and developed they are, the further one will find oneself on the ladder. So I think we're kind of at a pathological stage in a lot of ways. Who cares unless we get caught, for some companies, and others have taken much more seriously their societal obligations and are working very hard to remedy it. And there are good people working in all of those companies to do the hard work of algorithmic bias assessment and bias mitigation and harms mitigation and responsible innovation, responsible AI. And it is not easy work. So I give them their full credit and due for working very hard to make sure that the AI they are developing doesn't harm people to varying degrees of success depending on the company.
Awesome. All right, I think we have time for 1, maybe 2, depending on the answer, I guess.
On how long I talk, yes.
Yes, yeah, actually. So, but at least 1. And so there's a couple of votes up for a question from Oren. What are your thoughts of post hoc explanations? They don't seem to be faithful to the explained model themselves.
I'm not sure I know exactly what the question is asking, but let me take a crack at it. You know, it's a challenge because of interactions with humans, right? So, you know, recently the Meta team at Twitter, led by Raman Chowdhury, released some research they had done about the amplification of various kinds of content on the Twitter platform. And there was an insight that content from the right was being amplified more than content from the left. I'm greatly simplifying. But the question is why, right? And so the post hoc explanation is not available yet entirely because it's not clear what is actually happening when the model is out in the wild. What are the human behaviors that are perhaps interacting with the model that is encouraging that model behavior? And so the field of explainable AI is still on an evolutionary path to getting to the point where we can actually do that in the wild assessment and post hoc explainability of the impacts, right, of our AI, not just how they were built. And human rights impact assessments and data impact assessments and all of those things are a beginning of it. But again, we're not at the generative phase of explainable AI. We are not at the optimized stage of explainable AI. We are much earlier on. And my call to everyone here today is let's step on the gas and accelerate our progress to that stage, because we just don't have any time to waste.
Awesome. Thank you, Yoav. Thank you for the delicate answer to some very difficult questions. And appreciate everybody's attention. We're going to go ahead and wrap things up now. If we didn't have a chance to answer your question, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Up next, we have the Responsible AI and Banking panel. If you don't get prompted to join that, you'll need to click on the agenda section at the top of your screen and then attend it from there. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Yoav, for just an amazing keynote. I learned a lot. Appreciate it today.